Thousands of years ago, a people, a land, and a language came together in Israel's birth, and the course of man's life and thought was lifted to a new point of elevation. Then, for centuries, this pattern was split asunder. The people, the land, and the language were separated, and tragedy and danger befell them all. Separated each from the other, none of these three achieved the creative potency which they each knew when they lived together. What is modern Israel except the reunion of this people, land, and language in a sublime fulfillment of history's cycle? A bridge thrown across the gulf of continents and generations to symbolize the unity of all historic experience.
It is a voice filled with echoes, and when you listen to it, bit by bit, the portrait of a nation takes shape. You can see the city of Tel Aviv on a warm evening in spring. The wind is soft in the cypress trees. At the edge of the Mediterranean, the sea breaks in long, gentle waves. Crowds press through the streets. There is a crackle of excitement like summer lightning, the sense of something profound about to happen. And then, exactly at midnight, a figure steps out on a balcony and begins to read a proclamation. By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine, to be called MENA, Israel, the state of Israel. With trust in Almighty God, we set our hand to this declaration, Sabbath Eve, the 5th of Iyar, the 14th day of May, 1948. And so a new nation is born, and all its dreams and hopes come alive on the tongue of this man, whose name is Abba Eban. The first hour of independence comes alive.
Nobody who lived that hour will ever forget its mingled sentiment. Israel was no sooner born than her very survival was imperiled. The gust of universal joy which swept the house of Israel and moved men of generous heart in every land was attended also by anguish and suspense. High opportunity and deadly danger, supreme ecstasy and icy fear came together in that moment side by side. As the specter of destruction hovered over us, we looked upon our newborn republic with a sense of the awesome fragility of all cherished things. A few decades ago, the prospect that an independent Jewish state could be established in its ancient homeland appeared so fantastic as to bring its advocates under suspicion of insanity. Statesmen and diplomats to whom the idea was broached in the early years of the First World War were startled at hearing so eccentric an idea even submitted to their official attention. A British ambassador in Paris, to whom our first president, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, summarized this project in 1915, wrote in his diary that he had encountered a remarkable contradiction. A man of eminent scientific attainments, with a keen power of rational analysis, who on this particular issue appeared to have gone completely off his head. Back in London, Prime Minister Asquith expressed surprise that one of his cabinet colleagues of Jewish faith, normally a man of excessive rationalism, was affected with delirium on this special point. Yet within a single lifetime, we have passed from a world in which the existence of an independent Israel seemed inconceivable into a world which seems inconceivable without its existence.
The first months of liberty were wreathed in smoke and gunfire. Tanks rumbled through the wheat fields. Sniper bullets laced the streets of Haifa. Jerusalem lay under siege. And yet, somehow, within 100 days, it was clear to the world that Israel would survive. And its people set about planting a nation in the hills of Galilee, across the plains of Sharon, and down through the wilderness of the Negev.
No human purpose has ever been accomplished against heavier calculations of chance. All the circumstances of time and place argued against our success. The place was fixed by history on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, where vigorous nationalisms were arising, far more disposed to claim national freedom for themselves than to concede it to others. The time was the sequel to the Second World War, when the Jewish people rose battered and bleeding from the violent onslaughts of tyranny. 6 million of our kinsmen had been slaughtered in the fields of Europe. Men, women, and children had been carted off to the furnaces like unwanted rubbish. The institutions of Jewish life and learning lay about us in ruin. The pride and repute of the Jewish people had been dragged down in calumny and degradation. Out of the darkest depths of man's divided nature, there had sprung at the throat of the Jewish people the most violent hatred that had ever convulsed or distorted the spirit of man. This was the lowest ebb in our fortunes. When many people believed that we had marked the end of the Jewish people's journey across history's stage, yet within a few years of this unexampled decline, behold, the Jewish Commonwealth had come into triumphant existence. Its flag flew bravely in the circle of banners which symbolized the freedom and equality of all nations on earth. Its life and culture entered upon a new birth of freedom. Warm waves of confidence and pride flowed into every home through the length and the breadth of the world where the traditions of Israel were still cherished and revered. The history of the Jewish people in this generation is dominated by this violent contrast between the dark frustrations of 1945 and the high peaks of achievement and opportunity to which we suddenly rose. Never was this people stronger than in its moment of weakness, never more hopeful than in its moment of despair.
By November 1948, Israel had been recognized by an overwhelming majority of states on 5 continents. She had held her first democratic elections, set up a legislature, issued coins and postage stamps, and set about rebuilding her cities. She had signed an armistice with Egypt, Lebanon, and Transjordan, and she had found a voice, the voice of Abba Eban.
The honor of our generation is engaged in Israel's fate. What would be the moral stature of a world in which so small a people could not pursue its destiny in peace after the buffets and tribulations of centuries past? This question of peace in Zion is not a marginal issue of mere local scope. It is one of the central issues of the universal conscience, and on its solution will hang consequences of awesome scale.
By the end of her first year of independence, Israel had survived many dangers, but her position in the circle of nations was still uncertain. The only road to true security lay through membership in the United Nations. In March 1949, the Security Council approved Israel's application. It remained to be ratified by the General Assembly, and so Abba Eban came to Lake Success. He was 33, the youngest representative ever to speak before the United Nations.
The state of Israel is bound to the United Nations by many links of intimacy and strength. Israel is new in the art of practical statecraft. We shall be fortunate if our contribution to the solution of international problems can go much beyond the limited size of our state. Yet Israel is at once the ancestor and the heir of a great universal tradition. The doctrines of the Charter, founded on the hope of international brotherhood, were bequeathed to modern civilization by Israel's prophetic writings, which expressed the longing of mankind for an era when nation shall not lift up the sword against nation, nor shall they know war any more.
One by one the delegates cast their votes, and by late afternoon of May 11th, 1949, Israel took her place in the United Nations. Her flag with its blue Star of David went up in the circle of banners, and the voice of Abba Eban began to become familiar in the council chamber. A voice alive with eloquence, touched with a wry humor.
An ostrich which buries its head in the sand to avoid facing unpalatable facts not only constitutes an undignified spectacle, it also offers an irresistibly inviting target.
The voice of a statesman capable of quiet irony.
There is a quality of devotion to country which men call patriotism when they possess it themselves, and chauvinism when they observe it in others.
The voice of a scholar, a man fluent in half a dozen languages, an authority on Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian literature, a man steeped in a proud tradition, a culture going back to the time of Abraham, sustained by prophecy and dreams of the future.
In the grammar of classical Hebrew, there is none of the sharp differentiation possessed by modern languages between that which is and that which shall be.
The voice of Israel is but a modern variation on a theme that has sounded for centuries.
It is the story of a small country on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in which a people of shepherds and farmers thousands of years ago proclaimed a message whose echoes are still the hope, the consolation, and the redemption of mankind. Against the prevailing mood of fatalism and resignation, the Hebrew mind set up the doctrine of a moral choice in the relations of man with his own conscience. Among peoples and societies of the ancient East, crushed by misery and exploitation, this message called for love and justice in the dealings of men with their neighbors. To a world in which war and massacre seemed part of man's essential nature, the literature of Israel in words of deathless beauty brought the revolutionary message of universal peace. These three principles of individual morality, social justice, and universal peace are the primary gifts of the Hebrew people and of the land of Israel to all peoples and all lands in all successive generations. Thus this small people and this little land were endowed in their influence on the course of history with dimensions far beyond the narrow limits of their space and size. The land of Israel is today again the abode of a free society, established by the very nation which gave those hills and valleys their ancient fame. The Hebrew language, in which the voice of conscience and freedom once spoke with matchless dignity and power, is again the daily speech of men from Dan to Beersheba, from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. To a citizen of Israel, these monuments and records are the credentials of nationhood. For modern Israel is no new Esperanto people born in a modern accident of history. Our new republic is in its own consciousness and in that of mankind the direct heir of Israel of old, the author of the Judeo-Christian civilization. Our national sentiment is enriched by this sense of derivation from ancient roots. The sentiment of historic continuity, the awareness of a noble past, are ever present in our hearts as the inspiration of our national effort. It is no small thing to tread the paths once followed by Hebrew kings and prophets, to tend the soil and pastures of David and Amos, to look out across the valley where Ezekiel saw the mysterious vision of revival.
Bit by bit, over the years, what began to emerge was not only a statesman declaring the policy of his nation, but an inspired spokesman for the Hebrew faith, the faith that was the wellspring of Christianity and the earliest design of man's dream of liberty. It was as a descendant of Moses and Isaiah and the Maccabees that he came to Notre Dame University.
4,000 years of history have extended their span between Israel's first nationhood and her restoration to freedom at the turning point of this century. The redemption from Egyptian bondage must be regarded in any serious view of history as one of the authentic points of climax in the progress of mankind. In the words of Henry George, from between the paws of the rock-hewn Sphinx rises the genius of human liberty, and the trumpets of the Exodus throb with the defiant proclamation of the rights of man. The flight across the Red Sea and Sinai preserved a revolutionary idea which could never have evolved in the idolatrous despotism of the pharaohs. The idea was the sovereignty of God, the ruler of the universe, omnipotent, one and indivisible, the embodiment of righteousness, and the loving Father of all creation. From this idea there flowed acceptances and rejections which came to dominate life amongst the children of man. Recognizing this event as the beginning of our true destiny, we, the descendants of these fleeing slaves, have in all succeeding generations commemorated the ancient saga. Our tradition to this day exhorts every Jew to recite the story of the Exodus from Egypt at the appointed season, as though he personally had experienced this redemption from servitude to freedom. The narrative of this rebellion against idolatry by men charged with the custody of an idea also occurs in the history of thought in a more secular aspect. The Exodus is the original and classic episode of national liberation. The memory of Israel's first struggle for freedom has inspired and consoled many subsequent movements for national independence. When Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were consulted on the emblem of the future American Union, they suggested that the seal of the United States should represent the children of Israel fleeing across the parted waters of the Red Sea on their way to freedom. This portrayal was to be surmounted by the uncannily Hebraic slogan, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God." It is not, I think, presumptuous to believe that future generations will keep the memories of Israel's modern revival with a similar reverence and tenacity. Nothing since the miraculous redemption 4,000 years ago can compete in our history with this recent transition from martyrdom to sovereignty, this most sudden ascent from the depths of agony to new peaks and opportunities of pride.
It had come, this voice, out of a tiny land, from Lake Kula to the Red Sea, from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan, is a stretch of earth smaller than the state of New Hampshire. And yet the meaning of this nation went beyond its boundaries. There never was a map that could show the full design of the human spirit.
There is nothing global or even massive about the state of Israel in political terms. The territory of our new independence is great in history, but pathetically meager in geography. True, it is the bridge between the three continents of the ancient world. It looks out over the highway which has marked the migrations and invasions of history's pageant. But in the calculations of the atomic century, this is a small and humble piece of earth. The bridge is fragile, the highway narrow. And in the age of air transportation, it no longer obtrudes itself inevitably athwart the paths of conquest and empire. The population directly affected falls short of 2 million. Even when we portray this event in its real essence as a collective climax in the history of the Jewish people, it still remains true that the conscious agents of Israel's revival are but a small fraction of the total human family. Clearly then, if modern Israel is to be regarded as an incident of universal scope, this is because of a stature to be ascribed to it in a completely different dimension. If modern Israel is to have any elements of greatness, then this quality must be vindicated in the spiritual realm. To say this is not to deny that some of Israel's material achievements are impressive and sometimes deeply moving. The collective survival of the Jewish people is itself a rare event of history. Many other peoples have lost their independence under the heel of invading empires, but no people other than this, having once been so engulfed, has shown such a capacity for recuperation as to preserve amidst martyrdom and dispersion all the elements of its union and identity, its language and tradition, its consciousness of attachment to the land of its origin, and the undying hope of eventual restoration. For long centuries, this people, whithersoever it wandered, continued to regard its inner life as rooted in a distant land, which few could ever hope to see with their own eyes. This connection, which for many generations was an act of mystic faith, became transformed against all material calculations into one of the political realities of our age. The banner of a free Israel now flies proudly again in the family of nations from which it had been absent for so many tragic generations.
In September 1950, at the age of 35, Abba Eban, already Israel's permanent delegate to the United Nations, now presented his credentials as ambassador to the United States. He came representing a land that was still half wilderness, a land into which new immigrants were pouring at the rate of 23 an hour. They came from 74 countries, survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, refugees from the ghettos of Baghdad and Marrakesh. Across the borders came the entire Jewish community of Yemen, and almost all the Jews of Libya, Iraq, Tripolitania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, as well as pioneers from Sweden, England, Italy, France, and the Americas. It was out of this incredible tapestry of types and colors that Abba Eban appeared in Washington.
There are no events in history so different in scale and yet so alike in their nature as the American Revolution in the 18th century and the establishment of Israel's independence in our own day and age. What happened in each case was that men thirsting for freedom, driven by insecurity and persecution, but also drawn by the attraction of building a new civilization, emigrated from all parts of the world to a new land across the seas. They reclaimed that land from primeval devastation. They liberated themselves from colonial shackles. They established a free republic, which they then defended against every adversary and peril until it secured its recognized place in the international family. In their cultural effort, they merged their diverse immigrant cultures into the unity of a new civilization. They maintained throughout every ordeal the original moral heritage which had inspired their underlying unity of purpose. It is the consciousness of being a nation of immigrants which sets the civic tradition of both peoples. A nation of immigrants cannot be a conservative nation. It is not a people which sees the pattern of its life and thought already set as from time immemorial. By contrast, if you look at some countries which have experienced no wave of newcomers for centuries, you see a deep-rooted train of thought and habit of mind. At the origin of the migration movement in both these cases, there was a consciousness amongst the founding fathers that the future of the country lay in its immigration. The normal economic suspicions of a settled population towards immigrants, coming to share their meager resources, find no expression in Israel's early history, nor do they appear for many decades in the documents of the American Revolution. In each case, the guiding thought was the necessity to accept present inconvenience for ultimate strength, a sense that true significance lay not in the achievements of today, but rather in the perspectives which today's achievement opened up for tomorrow's expansion. From this came a restlessness, a tendency to look forward more than backward, and at the best there came a spirit of tolerance, because an immigrant society, constantly facing the impact of new forces, cannot afford the ingrained prejudices which a more settled civilization sometimes permits for itself. The second common memory of both countries is of pioneering. Certainly the ordeals of Israel in its first decade of independence amount to luxury when compared with the early records of pestilence and disease against which the American pioneers struggled for a far longer period. There are chronicles which, as late as the early decades of the 19th century, expressed doubt whether it was within the power of man to dominate the wild forces of nature which were hostile to every possibility of settled life in this continent.
You will find the record of that hour written down in the cracked pages of old diaries, in the faded scrawl of letters like this one, dated November 12th, 1848. My dearest brother, I write you these few words, although I do not know if I shall live to send them to you. We have lost our trails somewhere in the Northwest Territory, all the oxen gone, and we have been walking for 31 days. Cousin Nancy's feet have commenced to bleed. We have come so far, it would be dreadful, cruel to perish now in the mountains. I've heard that Oregon is beautiful country, mostly in valleys and rivers. It ought to be beautiful, to pay us for our pain in getting to it.
The twin memories of immigration and pioneering constitute a firm basis for establishing the case of affinity between these two historical events. But perhaps they would have little more than antiquarian value if they were not reflected in what is the most important element in our common tradition, the democracy and republicanism both of the United States and of Israel. As early as the first assembly of colonists in New Haven in 1639, we find in the writings of Jonathan Mayhew a discussion of the form of government to which the colonies should aspire. For his listeners, the only manner in which that question could be answered was by reference to the character of ancient Hebrew societies. In regard to the legal form which the settlers of New England should establish, Mayhew said, "Hebrew writings hold forth a perfect rule for the direction and government of all men in all duties which they are to perform towards God or towards each other, just as much in the government of families and state and commonwealth as in matters of the church." Finally, we find an element of close affinity when we look at the culture and the science of our two countries, not from the viewpoint of their standards, which are obviously divergent, but rather according to the processes whereby they came into being, diverse elements, drawn from every race and language and tradition, have come together to create an initial confusion, which American history remembers and which Israel still experiences. But the confusion yields in a generation or so to an underlying unity. I do not know of any two peoples who have created unified cultures out of so many divergent elements which might have seemed destined to disrupt the fabric of the national mind. I do not think it is necessary to stress the religious affinities as another common element in the two traditions, for it is an element common not particularly to America and to Israel, but to almost every country which embraces the Western tradition. The native Hebrew stream nourished the great tributary rivers of Christianity and Islam, while keeping its own sources constantly refreshed.
At the turn of her first decade, Israel paused in her labors and took stock of what had been done and what was yet to be done. The once empty borders were strung with villages. The once barren fields were green with corn and barley. They had planted trees on the bare Judean hills and new settlements across the wastes of the Negev. They had put up thousands of miles of highways and pipelines. They were taking chemicals from the Dead Sea and copper from the mines that had once belonged to King Solomon. They had made the ancient Hebrew language live again and settled more than 1 million immigrants upon the land. They had turned a scattered people with a haunted past into a modern nation with a bright future. And only they could count the cost.
Israel is a people to whom nothing is freely given. Its sovereignty, its narrow land, its scanty water, its capital city, the safety of its homes and lives, its membership in the international family, its commerce with other countries, its maritime access to half the world, gifts which other nations inherit at their birth, are for us the fruit of bitter contest. Her difficulties are the only possessions of Israel which nobody has ever tried to take away. In its international relations, as in other aspects of its fortune, Israel lives in a world of sharp contrasts. This people, says a Hebrew tradition, is like unto the stars of heaven and unto the dust of the earth. There is nothing like the savagery of our neighbor's hatred, but we are also reached by affections of unique tenderness and ardor. Indifference is the only emotion which Israel has never evoked during these unforgettable years of her resurgence. The 10th year is still embattled, but its vision is not without radiance. The 20th will find Israel with its 3rd million of population, with the Negev and Galilee abloom, with Jordan waters carried southward to the dry places. The pulse of commerce will beat strongly between Eilat and the eastern continents, while the links grow tighter between Israel and her own Mediterranean world. Nuclear and solar energy will bring freedom from the servitudes of imported oil and give Israel a horizon as broad as its scientific disciplines can reach. The Hebrew faith and tradition will gain new strength everywhere through the emanation of Israel's example. These achievements are all within Israel's power. Peace, the final gift, is in the hand of others, although its pursuit is still amongst the first laws of Israel's policy. The first decade hands on the unfinished tasks, but it will never be eclipsed in Israel's memory, for in the eyes of an aged, weary people, it rekindled the splendor of a youthful dawn.
All through the 1950s, we watched the Middle East with anxious eyes. Each morning seemed to bring new headlines of a blockade, a troop movement, the raiding of a village, an exchange of gunfire across the borders.
I cannot speak to you of these turbulent events without acute sorrow for our Middle East, whose horizons are darkened by such heavy clouds. The grief is the more acute when we reflect what we could achieve if this hostility were announced, so that our kindred peoples could unite their efforts for the renaissance of their common region. This sense of high purpose, obstructed by immediate preoccupation, came to me with special force when I read of 2 events in Israel, ostensibly small events in the perspectives of journalism, which engaged our people's interest in recent weeks. The first was the extension through new equipment of a Department of Nuclear Physics at Rehovot, which has already brought our country a modest but cherished international renown. The second was the acquisition by the nation of ancient scrolls inscribed with literature from the golden age of revelation, the age when the Hebrew mind achieved its deepest insights into the nature of man and his universe. In these two disconnected items of news, I saw reflected in a sudden flash the whole essence of Israel's destiny, the attribute of potential greatness which belongs to this small people in this little land. Nuclear physics and biblical scrolls, the inscrutable mysteries of the future, and the imperishable memories of the past. And now the one people, the only people whose continuous national memory has comprehended the full cycle from ancient prophecy to modern science, is restored to the land, the language, and the freedom of its original inheritance. We have wandered too long in deep and lonely valleys, with narrow objectives before us of mere physical survival and defense against the fierce assaults of hostile worlds. And now the hand of history has restored us to our small but lofty elevation, from which we look down on vast perspectives, stretching at our feet on either side, backward 4,000 years towards antiquity, and forward to the awesome challenge of atomic generations.
For generations, the Middle East was swept by suspicions and ancient hatreds. But now, in our time, there appeared a hope that linked the Nile and the River Jordan, the Sea of Galilee and the Persian Gulf. The mathematical equation knows no boundaries. The scientific formula reads precisely the same in Hebrew and in Arabic. Out of the lecture halls of universities in Cairo and in Jerusalem, out of the engineering schools in Beirut and in Haifa, out of the laboratories of Israel's Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, out of experimental stations in Lebanon and Jordan, came a dream common to both Arab and Jew. The dream that science might help bring an end to poverty and hunger.
Our region has much to gain from the intensive application of scientific research. The Middle East is not inherently a poor area, as its past history amply proves. Across its expanses there are ample resources of manpower, skills, natural resources with which to sustain a prosperous civilization. This region has fallen far behind the best levels of modern progress through its backwardness in the application of scientific processes, as well as through conflict and divisions which deny the essential truth of our regional fraternity. May we not hope that an end will come to these sterile habits of boycott, ostracism, and hostility, that the barriers which divide Israel from its neighbors will fall, and that the waves of scientific progress will flow across a broader domain between Israel and the Arab world. The people of Israel and of the Arab world have both woven golden threads in the tapestry of scientific history through the Middle Ages down to our own times. We are reminded here of the potentiality which lies within all small countries in an age of scientific development. Small countries often ask themselves whether the history of the 20th century must be written exclusively by the great imperial and continental powers. In military strategy and in economic strength, there is little that countries as small as Israel can do to emulate the achievements of their more powerful colleagues in the international community. But in the world of intellect and science, we all stand equal. Any country, large or small, which develops a sound scientific tradition may have something to contribute to the abundance which science has bequeathed to our universal potentiality. It is not an accident that some of the greatest scientific figures of this age have arisen in countries little larger than Israel in their territory and population. We are a small land and shall always so remain, but in intellectual, spiritual, and cultural progress we are as free as any nation to soar to the highest peaks available to human effort and initiative. We do not consider that it is the destiny of small countries to be condemned to provincialism. We recall that Israel thousands of years ago was a small country in a barren strip of land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, surrounded by rich and powerful empires. But those empires have crumbled in the dust, while our small voice has come down across the centuries in constant and undying strength.
In the spring of 1955, the world bowed its head in mourning for the death of Albert Einstein, the man who had done so much to unlock the mysteries of space and time, finally passed beyond its dimensions. Mathematician, philosopher, teacher, exile, Jew, he had always been a friend of Israel, and it was somehow fitting that it should be Abba Eban who rose in New York's town hall to speak of him.
He lived in solitude and grandeur in a realm of transcendent thought, and he looked upon his world from a vantage point which nobody else could fully share. It is difficult to think of any single man since antiquity who so sharply transformed the thought of mankind by the influence and impression of his life. We live in a world in which the smallest mass holds the secret of the most violent energy, in which forces previously considered disconnected and arbitrary fit into a single potent equation, in which vast abundance and unlimited destruction confront mankind in sharp and awful contrast. It is a world quite different from that which preceded the Einstein epoch, and the change is the direct conclusion of his pursuit of new and uncharted truths. His humility was profound and sincere, but it was also misleading. Because of the modesty of his bearing, we were not always aware that we had in our midst a giant of history, the chief pride and ornament of his generation. By his rebellion against scientific dogma, in a flash of insight beyond the realm of Newtonian physics, he forced men everywhere to think differently about their universe than had all previous generations across centuries of time.
The new horizon that opened when Albert Einstein wrote down his formula for harnessing the power of the atom led finally to the United Nations, and Abba Eban stepped to the rostrum to speak in the debate on the uses of atomic energy. His entire career as statesman had come after Hiroshima. His most profound thoughts had been shaped in the age of the cyclotron, and what began as the voice of the newborn state of Israel had now become the voice of mankind in this hour that could mean life or death for civilization.
Like all previous advances in natural discovery, but more than any of them, the liberation of atomic energy can be the herald of a more abundant age. For there is nothing inherently evil in atomic power. Whether this new energy becomes a source of destruction or of expanding welfare lies fully within the realm of human decision, and the direction in which the balance falls will depend on our success or failure in the adjustment of international relations. Never has diplomacy been able to influence such broad issues of opportunity and danger. Never have the alternatives of disaster and salvation confronted the human race in such acute and poignant contrast. The representatives of small nations approach this issue from a special point of vantage. In discussions of atomic war, we possess no equality with more powerful countries, nor do we envy them their awesome preponderance with its consequent burdens of responsibility. At most, we are amongst the passive objects of such debates, conscious that international discord and atomic power together make an equation full of menace for humanity. But our position is transformed. Our stature increased when we come to discuss the application of this energy to peaceful ends. Here we can stand on more equal ground. Wherever the human mind can actively probe the mysteries of this force, there is a chance of some new insight into its nature, some original contribution to its range of potential use. All nations which develop a sound scientific tradition may have a constructive purpose to fulfill in an age of atomic peace. Similarly, all countries, small as well as great, can be the beneficiaries of the new inheritance which science has bequeathed to our universal opportunity. The peaceful use of nuclear energy opens out especially exciting vistas for countries which are deficient in the conventional sources of power. It has been estimated that a cube of uranium 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch contains as much latent energy as 2,600,000 pounds of coal. In such a world, well-trained scientific minds and disciplined hands may become the only indispensable condition for establishing the highest standards of welfare to which any society can reasonably aspire. May we not hope that in peaceful research and application our governments and scientists will develop cooperative habits which will illuminate a path towards agreement in the control of atomic weapons, and thus lift a weight of anguish from the heart of suffering and apprehensive mankind. For good or ill, but in any case with complete irrevocability, atomic science has set us on a crossroads from which two paths branch forth, the one leading to immeasurable abundance, the other towards disaster beyond comprehension by heart or mind. May our deliberations be guided with wisdom and humanity as we stand within the shadow of this fateful choice.